This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hey, I've got a quick note about today's episode. Kathryn and I welcome Alina Sayre, an award-winning middle grade fantasy writer. She's awesome. There is so much great stuff in this episode. We talk about the quality of prose, finding the voice of your protagonist, writing for your audience, the fantasy greats that most of us grew up reading, and shifts in fantasy for younger readers. And there are so many takeaways from this episode, but I wanted to point out that there is a little static that comes through on Alina's Skype line, and editing improved it but could not get rid of it. So enjoy the episode. Just be forewarned before you put in earbuds and go for a jog or something. So enjoy the episode, and please head over to wordessential.com/storyworksroundtable. Kathryn puts together amazing show notes every week, and she timestamps every single shift in the conversation. So each of those topics we touch on, you can find them right there, listed out with the timestamps, as well as links to anything we mention, our guests' websites, their photos, bios, book covers, all in the show notes. So enjoy today's episode. We're talking middle grade fantasy with award-winning author Alina Sayre. Welcome to today's Storyworks Roundtable. Kathryn and I are excited to have award-winning author Alina Sayre here to talk about middle grade fantasy as part of our genre series. Now, I was looking at Alina's reviews, and they seem to be primarily written by adults, not only saying how much their kids love the books, but how much they love them. In fact, one reviewer was reading Alina's first book for the third time. So I want to say middle grade in quotes, because really our guest is writing ageless fantasy that happens to be appropriate for middle grade readers. Alina Sayre began her literary career chewing on board books and has been in love with words ever since. Now she's an editor, educator, speaker, and award-winning author of The Voyages of the Legend, a fantasy series for ages 9 through 12. Her debut novel, The Illuminator's Gift, won a silver medal in the Moonbeam Children's Book Awards and was a semi-finalist for the Book Life Prize in Fiction, and a finalist in the Shelf Unbound Best Indie Book Competition. All three books in the Voyages of the Legend series have received 5-star reviews from readers' favorite. When she's not writing, Alina enjoys hiking, crazy socks, and reading under blankets. She does not enjoy algebra or wasabi. And when she grows up, she would like to live in a castle with a large library. You can find Alina at alinasayre.com, and we're going to have a link to that in the show notes. Welcome, Alina.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome.
Yeah, we're thrilled. Now, as I mentioned, I was looking through your reviews, and I was just so impressed that readers were commenting on the beauty of your prose. It just does my heart good to see that. And I would really like to start there. How does your attitude toward writing, or maybe your philosophy of writing, play into your voice as a storyteller?
That is a very interesting question. Well, I think it's fair to say that I really enjoy poetry. I know not too many prose enthusiasts also do that, but it's sort of my under the table interest, and I think that probably comes out in my writing. I think some of the poetry workshops I took in college really taught me to pay attention to things you notice with your 5 senses, and ways to express your feelings in words that seem appropriate to them. And even though I have not published any poetry, I think that that interest plays in. I also had the advantage of being raised on the best middle grade writers, or middle grade / every genre, all the way up to adult. I was raised on the Lord of the Rings trilogy, had it read aloud to me when I was 8 years old.
Nice.
And so I think really the bar for me was set high when it came to not only interesting storytelling, but handling language. Plus, I think it's the most interesting thing there is. So, yeah, I think that's probably some of the source of my voice as a writer. I still read ravenously. One of my favorite middle grade authors is Kate DiCamillo, who's just known for her beautiful lyrical storytelling voice. And so I really think the writers that you surround yourself with will influence your voice. And I know that's definitely been a big influence for me. Yeah, philosophy of storytelling. I don't know. Again, I read a lot as a child, and I think that really influenced the tone I take when I tell my own stories.
Right.
Kids like to read stories about kids who are adventurous and active and have agency, not about kids who are sitting around waiting for adults to rescue them.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, that definitely took a few tries to get it right. The first book, especially. When I was writing The Illuminator's Gift, the adults were telling the story the first few times around, and I just had to keep coming back to it again and again until an actual 12-year-old was telling the story. And then she kind of made the rest of the story her own. It was awesome.
Wow, that is so many great points in there, and I want to come back to the voice of that protagonist, of the 12-year-old telling the story. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the canon of fantasy literature that you grew up with. I imagine books by like C.S. Lewis, Lewis Carroll, Madeleine L'Engle, more recently Philip Pullman and J.K. Rowling have informed your development as a writer. Would you care to comment on that?
Absolutely. Yes to all. I have to say I found Madeleine L'Engle terrifying as a child.
Oh,
but
other than that, really? Why?
It's the nameless enemy named It that pulses and steals your consciousness. Like, that was a terrifying concept. But other than that, yes, I have to confess that I just finished reading The Golden Compass yesterday for the first time. So it did not really inform me as a child, but as an adult, I was really in awe of Pullman's handling of prose and the originality of his storytelling. So it's amazing how that can keep growing even as an adult. I think it's good to visit the world of children's literature and see what kids are reading, because the challenges they face have changed over time. I'm also a tutor, so I work with kids all the time. Getting to talk with them and see what their lives are like now helps me to get a sense of what their world is. Even though literature is timeless, the problems that kids face are always changing.
Right, that's so interesting. So if you look at an older work like Lord of the Rings and a newer work like Harry Potter, and then think about the kids that you work with, are there any parallels or any disparities that you can draw in children as readers? And you mentioned the problems they face or the concerns they have.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that one of the special things about fantasy is that it never goes out of style. It's always fresh and new because it's not dated the way that contemporary literature is. I think the big difference is probably the difficulty of the prose. My students, while they love the plot lines of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, a lot of them really see the writing difficulty as a barrier. And especially when they realize there are, 80 pages of historical narration before we actually get to any plot. And I think that is very much a creature of the time when Tolkien was writing. I think attention spans have shrunk, and kids are not used to having to plow through pages and pages of kind of this made-up history, rich as it is. And the difficulty of his vocabulary.
Right.
If they make it past that, initial hurdle, they love it. They really get into it. But I think fantasy for children now tends to focus on getting right to the point, and making it a little bit more accessible for where they're at now. I actually think that's probably across all genres, not just fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So when you write, do you focus on that, getting right to the point you said? So starting with action,
That's
introducing the protagonist right away.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
I work with a team of beta readers each time I publish a book. And one of my questions for them is always, does this story take too long to get going? Mm-hmm. Because I love the lyrical introduction probably too much, and grew up on Lord of the Rings myself. Mm-hmm. So I think I probably was influenced by that more than is healthy in today's culture. So I always ask their feedback. Can you help me to know when this is dragging? When have I given enough information and just need to get to that first action scene already? Mm-hmm. But I also try to play to my strengths, and realizing that character development and dialogue are some of my stronger suits as a writer. I try to not follow just a formula, because that's how it's expected.
Right.
So it's kind of a balancing act there.
Mm. Yeah, that is such a great point, to play to your strengths and avoid following a formula. I think so much fiction today can fall into the formulaic, unfortunately, especially as lots of people are trying to write to market. They can make the error of doing that pushing that to the point of being formulaic and not being fresh within the realm of reader expectations or genre considerations.
Absolutely. It's one of my pet peeves in writing, when it's like, I've read this book before, because it's like the entire series. It especially pushes my buttons with young adult novels, where we have the obligatory love triangle and then some magic, and then one of the boys is good and one of them is bad, and they always pick the bad one for a while. So why do we have to have this love triangle anyway? This is one reason I love middle grade writing, because we can really dodge a lot of the teen angst that comes with young adults.
Right, get them fresh and young.
Right, exactly. They're a lot more interested in adventure and journeys and quests at that age, which I think is a lot more fun to write.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was noticing in the opening of your first book, you've got the Ellie, the protagonist, kind of being bullied by her, so-called adopted brother, and he takes her sketchbook out of her hands and dangles it over a puddle of mud. And it just gets you, because what that sketchbook means to her. For us writers, it would be like taking our journal of handwritten stories that, is irreplaceable, and dashing it in the mud. And that was such a great way to hook us right away with some action. And it didn't have to be explosive. It didn't have to be magical. It was just very human and real and relatable. And the stakes were high, because sure, it's just a book of paper, but it's something that Ellie is invested in. So
exactly. Well, I can tell you, I wrote that scene over at least 5 times to get it to that point. So that book went through a lot of evolution before it got to its current state.
Yeah, I think we can all say that about our best scenes,
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, I only wrote that one 20 times.
Absolutely. Painstaking.
So, how do you think that the tropes or themes of middle grade fantasy, or fantasy generally, has evolved? You were talking about the readership, the young readership, changing expectations, attention span, etc., changing. So what, is there more violence or edginess the way there is in YA, or has middle grade kind of stayed, shy of that,
yeah,
that
that's
trend?
A great question. I think that's definitely true in more contemporary literature. A lot of the Newbery winners and the contemporary setting books that I've read for middle graders are very edgy. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's important that kids who have been through situations like divorce or depression have someone in a book that they can relate to, because those are unfortunately real situations that kids go through. However, for kids who have led a more sheltered life, I think those things can be hard to find in a book. They don't know what to do with it at that age. I think fantasy is a little bit more insulated because it's not set in a schoolyard that kids go to every day. It's a little more timeless. I still think there's room for kids to encounter difficult situations. I know for me growing up, escaping into the Lord of the Rings trilogy was a great way to process the difficult things happening in my life, because you can find the analogies and the parables in the quest, in the fellowship and the sacrifice that they make, to parallel real things that happen in life, without it being too in your face or too edgy for an 8, 10-year-old to handle. So I think fantasy today has kind of continued that trend where it's handling current events, but in a more of an off-center way, which I think is very healthy.
Yeah, well, and I think that's one of the great strengths of fantasy is that you're using metaphor and analogy for dealing with these issues instead of, just confronting them face on, which is useful regardless the age of the reader.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's more enjoyable, more fun to escape into it and then maybe let your subconscious process some of that stuff.
Absolutely.
So have you written with, have you written with a mind to some of your scenarios in your stories being metaphors for specific issues that kids face or world events or anything? Have you consciously made any of those connections?
That's a really good question. Well, the main character, Ellie, she has dyslexia. I never name it that in the story because fantasy world that they're in, that wouldn't be appropriate. But I have read up on dyslexia and I work with students who have it. And so even though she's a very talented artist, she struggles with reading, and that sometimes makes her feel like she's dumb and she can't keep up with the other kids. She's worth less than they are. So that's without being a major emphasis in the story. I try not to preach at the reader, but I hope that a kid reading this story, whether they have dyslexia or whether it's another issue that just makes them feel a little bit slower or like less valuable than their peers, would be able to find a friend in Ellie and see their own value as something that's not necessarily quantifiable on a test. So there's that. I think it's also kind of a message of overcoming fear, whatever that fear may be, being someone of courage who, when there's a need, you stand up to it. You become the leader that you need to see in the situation. And I think that's one of the kind of timeless themes of fantasy in general, is learning to become the hero of the story. Yeah. Even when the character isn't necessarily made that way. Ellie starts out the series as a very timid, very reticent character. And it's over time when she's forced into scenarios where someone needs to do something and there's no one but her, that she'll stand up and do what needs to be done, even if she's not thinking about it. She doesn't think of herself as brave, but her friends need her, or her fleet needs her. And so she'll stand up and do the right thing out of almost a knee-jerk reaction. Over time, those cumulative choices show her to be someone who is brave. So I think that's it, rather than tying to any specific event or cultural phenomenon. I think it's just that message we all need in our lives.
So true.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I have to say it's been inspiring for me to write this, because I journey along with the characters. And watching them come into themselves and become people of courage, it kind of challenges me, even though they're fictional. What would I do in their shoes? What is the right thing for them to do next?
Yeah, that's so cool. And that's kind of the ideal of the hero's journey, is for the reader to embark on the journey with the hero and to have a transformative experience vicariously through the hero, and we get to do that as writers too.
Absolutely, perhaps more so.
Probably.
It can be very convicting.
Yes. Wow. So you were just talking about Ellie. So let's go back to that, what you said at the beginning about the voice and finding her voice and making sure the story was being told by the 12-year-old and not letting the adults in the story control it. I'll just let you reflect on that.
Ooh. Well, the first book was something I began writing almost 9 years ago. So the beginnings of that are quite some time ago. But I do know that it definitely went through, I think it went through 5 complete drafts over the process of 5 years. Just working and reworking. I think the beginning was something I really struggled with because it really sets the tone for a story. And if you can't nail the beginning, the rest seems to wobble a little bit.
Right.
Yeah, so I cut the cast of characters in about half. I realized that I was spreading out the responsibilities too thin, so that we had a lot of characters spending a lot of time backstage. Not helpful. So shrinking the cast really helped it.
Yeah.
I also changed some of those responsibilities from adult characters to child characters. And while that may make the children in the story a little bit of kind of exaggerations of children in the real world. I mean, there are children in the world who are incredibly courageous and intelligent and clever people, but the characters are a little bit idealized. I think readers would rather look up to their character rather than down. So if they're a little bit idealized, we can tolerate it more than if we're just annoyed with this incompetent character. I know I am when I read. So that helped to give the children in the story a sense of agency and of leading the story.
Right, and that is so important for writers to keep in mind, no matter what genre, that if you're writing younger characters, you really need to step up the game in terms of what these characters can do and what you imagine is possible for them. I was just watching one of those history reality shows that PBS and the BBC do, and they, took people and put them back in a Victorian slum. And they were saying how in order for them to earn enough money for their rent in the week, they had to put their children to work. And in the 1860s and 70s, children were working in factories at the age of 7. And, if they were at home doing like piecework with their parents, there was no law protecting them at home. So these little children would be working 12-hour days, or they'd be out on the street selling watercress or something. So, those of us who've grown up with the idea of childhood as being this protected age that should be precious and safe and idyllic, and,
right.
that's not the stuff of good drama, of good fiction.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And it hasn't always been true, and it's not true in many parts of the world. So I think with that reality in mind, it becomes even more important to show the children in the story being the heroes of their own stories.
Right.
Because in many places, children have no choice.
Yeah, exactly. And it's useful, I think, for me as a writer to see something like that and go, oh yeah, that really is reality. Like,
right.
It wasn't that long ago. And as you said, in lots of places in the world, children had those responsibilities and those expectations. And so it's not ridiculous for us to put our characters in those situations. It might go against our sensibilities.
Right. It's not. Hard sometimes. I'm like, what am I doing to these kids? Like,
I know.
The trauma they will have been through. And yet, without conflict, there is no story, as a college professor likes to remind me constantly.
Yeah.
I had the fault too often of trying to save my characters from conflict situations because I didn't want them to suffer, and then there was no story.
Right. No. Yeah, it's got to be from the fry pan to the fire.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what about Ellie's voice specifically? Did you find yourself going into a certain syntax or giving her kind of an accent or rhythm to her speech? How did you find that voice and make it distinct from other characters in your world and from your own voice as the authorial presence?
Absolutely. Ellie's voice has developed over time. I think
Mm-hmm.
all of those drafts I did of the first book, I think just writing it over and over and over again really helped me to hit a sound that I liked. I did some in character journaling when I was getting it done for each of the different characters, and I'm a regular journaler myself, so to try to journal in the voice of someone else was not only challenging, it helped me to kind of hear the rhythm that each character thinks in.
Yes.
The things they would notice about their daily life. Ellie's best friend, Jeriel, is extremely athletic and bubbly and energetic, and so her journal would be just a constant stream of activity, exciting things that happen, whereas Ellie is much more introverted and reflective and shy of the world around her, and so she would notice more things. As a journaler, she would have this vivid life, assuming she could get someone to do the writing for her because of the dyslexia.
Right.
But I think Ellie and I have more in common as characters. I chose a main character who I could relate with. And I think that made it easier for me to find her voice, even though we're not the same person. It just made it a little bit more natural. I think it would have been a lot harder for me to write this story from Jeriel's perspective. And we wonder what it would sound like. But yeah, Ellie's voice is, I notice with her, she stutters a lot. She'll begin a sentence and then falter and change her mind about what she wants to say, or doubt whether she should bring up that point, maybe decide not to say it after all. A lot of the story is inside her head. She may not say everything she's thinking, but her voice as the point of view character is very observant, even though she may not have the most lines in the book of spoken dialogue. So that's been kind of interesting for me to discover, trying to be authentic to the character as the books have gone. And as she's grown too, from book to book, trying to keep that voice updated to her development and her age has been a challenge. It doesn't stay the same.
That's so interesting. I love journaling as characters. I find interviewing them doesn't work for me because, I don't know, it just kind of like halts my creative flow. But if I step into the character and do the journaling, I find that so much more productive for me.
The same way.
Absolutely.
Journaling all the way.
Yeah, I love what you were saying about Ellie not having the most lines of dialogue in the book, and yet she is the protagonist. And, you know, I think could be a great takeaway for some of our writers out there, that you need to be true to your character, and just because someone is the point of view, the perspective through which the reader experiences the story, doesn't mean that character needs to be verbose or needs to be, you know, a center stage star or something. So
exactly. That's something I worried about a lot when I first was getting the book ready for publication. I thought readers will be looking for someone who's exciting and active and, you know, never fears danger, and, you know, what are they going to think of this, you know, kind of timid girl who would rather not be going on adventures. And what's interesting is that I've had both adults and children come back and say, I really related to Ellie. I thought she was very personable. She reminded me of myself. I liked that she had to overcome kind of the fear within, as well as the dangers she faces from out. And that really surprised me, that not everyone is looking for the same kind of protagonist. As I thought more about it, I realized I don't look for necessarily the most exciting protagonist when I read a book. I really enjoy a protagonist who's thoughtful and reflective of their situation.
Yes.
So I think what you were saying about writing the market earlier, it's more important to just be, sounds cliche, but being true to who you are as a writer and what your experiences are, your own voice, because that's what's going to sound authentic, rather than, well, Suzanne Collins did it, so I will be great at it.
Yes, so, absolutely. I'm a big fan of...
a scary choice to make, too.
Yeah. I think we need to write the story we're called to write as individual artists, you know, do what is best for that specific story. And then you can worry about the marketing.
Exactly. And I think that's why the market doesn't ever get full. Even though, I mean, The Hunger Games has already been told, The Chronicles of Narnia has already been told, Lord of the Rings has already been told, what else is there? Even the concept of the hero's journey, where many stories come back to that same pattern. Why doesn't it ever get old? I think it has to do with writers telling the story authentically as they see it in their voice.
Yeah, I agree. Those are great words of wisdom to wrap up on. Kathryn, do you want to add anything or ask any questions before we close this episode?
No, I think that was fantastic. I think it's interesting listening to the whole idea of writing from a children's perspective thing is fascinating to me because I've never done it. So it's cool.
I think that was a very vivid time of my life, being 8 to 12 years old, and that it's easy for me to go back there in my mind. So I think in some ways it's easier than it would be writing for adults.
Yeah.
Maybe we write to stay children in our minds.
Cool. I love that. Write to stay children in our minds. And on those words, we are going to close this episode of the Storyworks Roundtable, but there will be a companion episode, another one with Alina Sayre, and you can find links to her website in the show notes. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.